Back on the show is Jackson Katz. He's an anti-sexist activist, author, and expert on violence, media, and masculinity. He's also the co-founder of Mentors in Violence Prevention, which has worked with college and professional athletes specifically on issues like the ones we're really looking at with Penn State, like we're looking at with Syracuse. And there's just so much to talk about today. So thanks for joining us, Jackson.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be with you, David.
I was looking at one of your latest Huffington Post articles, and you talk a lot about this naming of accusers versus victims in different abuse stories that we've looked at in the media over many, many years. And it's really interesting what you focus on there. Tell me a little bit about what you've observed with that dynamic.
Well, I think since roughly around the time of the Kobe Bryant rape trial in the 2004 timeframe, the journalistic convention in referring to alleged victims or victims of sexual crimes and domestic violence and sexual abuse crimes, the journalistic convention has been to call them accusers rather than victims or alleged victims. And basically what my argument is that this is a very backward turn. It's a very anti-victim turn. And what ends up happening when you call people who are victims or alleged victims accusers is you reverse the process of sympathetic identification with the victim, which is part of, I think, what happens when we hear about somebody who's been victimized. We think, oh, that's really sad, or that's too bad, or even maybe it could have been me or somebody that I cared about. And so there's a sympathetic identification with the victim. But when you turn a victim into an accuser, you reverse this process, because now she, or it could be he as well, he is now not the victim. She is the accuser. She's the one doing something to him. She's accusing him of a crime. And so we're positioned, I think, in the public to identify sympathetically with him as the victim of her accusation, rather than her as the alleged victim of his act of sexual violence. And so it subtly but profoundly shifts our sympathies away from the victim and towards the perpetrator. And I think this is a really, really bad turn, if you will. And I think a lot of journalists and others don't even think about it. They just use the word accuser. But what my piece in the Huffington Post talked about was, in this case, or I should say in the Penn State case, there's been more discussion about the victims of Jerry Sandusky rather than the accusers of Jerry Sandusky. And I think it's really interesting to look at both the fact that they were children when they were victimized and the fact that they were boys who are now men, because I think both the social position and age and the gender of the victims has a lot to do with how we describe them in the media discourse.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to ask you. Do you see that this tends to be one way or another in terms of victim, alleged victim, and accuser based on the gender of the victim? Does that seem to be a key factor here in how the media portrays it?
Yes, there's no doubt it's a key factor. And I think the fact that in the Jerry Sandusky victims are boys, I think that a lot of men are more comfortable calling them victims. I think that a lot of men are made more uncomfortable by this crime because they can sympathetically identify in a way that a lot of men, for some reason, over the years have been so desensitized to women's victimization and to women's men's violation of women and women's bodies that it's, I think a lot of people, and men and women, are accustomed, I think, to calling women accusers now in a way that they're not as comfortable calling men or boys accusers. And one of the questions, which is, it's hard to answer, but if the victims in this case had been girls, in the Penn State case, what would be the conversation? Would it be the same? Would we talk about, the victim asking for it in some ways, or the way that she was dressed? That's the kind of thing that comes up over and over again when girls and women are the victims. But when boys are the victims, there's less victim blaming, and I think that's very gendered.
When I was looking, I think it was just about 2 weeks to the day after we heard about after the Jerry Sandusky arrest, I read about the Syracuse basketball assistant coach, Bernie Fine, who was also now being investigated for sexual abuse allegations that actually date back some years. And some of the reactions that I read online were, hey, it's too much of a coincidence that this happens right after Penn State. Somebody's trying to get this guy in trouble. And my reaction was, shouldn't we be looking at this as there is such shame often associated with coming out and talking about something like this happening, that can't we say, if it is tied to the Penn State news, isn't this a good thing that maybe the Penn State horrible situation has actually empowered some people, some other men, to come out and say, you know what, this happened to me too somewhere else, and I want to talk about it?
You're right on the money. That's exactly what's going on. And anybody who works in the field, the sexual abuse treatment field or prevention field, knows that this is a phenomenon that when one case comes to public light and there's some sympathy and empathy that's expressed in media and in public and other places for victims, rather than blaming victims, that other victims come forward. And so that's a predictable process. People in the field predicted this was going to happen, that once the Penn State case broke, there was other cases would come out. And, I think that's, by the way, this has been shrouded. Men's sexual violence against men and boys has been shrouded in secrecy and shame and silence for a long time. And it's starting to come out now. I mean, obviously the Catholic Church scandal over the past decade is a big marker in historical terms, in terms of, big institution with all kinds of social power and political power being challenged, and victims coming forward and being honest about what had happened to them. And the world changes as a result of the courage of victims that come forward. The U.S. military is now dealing with male sexual assault victims, in a way that it hadn't in previous, decades or centuries. And now this, the elite male sports culture is now having to address this. These are tectonic shifts, and I do think it's important that more public discussion about victims and not blaming them, but actually, applauding their courage is a big step in that process.
I've started to get a lot of emails from people saying, you know what, the way I feel this Jerry Sandusky thing is going to play out is that most or all of the evidence is going to end up being considered circumstantial. The best evidence for what happened is going to be people that end up getting talked out of or scared out of, either by themselves or by other people, from actually testifying about this, and that Sandusky is going to get little to no punishment for this, and it's going to actually, in the long term, reinforce the idea that accusers will not want to speak out. Victims will not want to speak out because they'll say, look at what happened with Sandusky, and barely anything happened to the guy. That's a real risk when we look at something like this, if real punishment doesn't end up happening, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a risk when somebody's charged with criminal conduct, especially when it comes to these highly sensitive issues like sexual abuse. But look, Joe Paterno, one of the most legendary coaches in the history of organized athletics, was fired. The president of the university was fired. There's been accountability already, and I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this because who knows how the process is going to play out in legal terms. But there's already been some significant accountability in this case, which is a good thing. I mean, I think people have been held responsible and accountable in ways that they haven't in the past. Powerful men, And again, who knows what's going to happen with Sandusky's. The legal proceedings against Sandusky, I don't know. I mean, rules of evidence and complicated legal maneuvering is going to be going on for the next many months. But I think the more that we can use this sad story to talk openly about what's going on, I think the better. The better. I think a lot of men, for example, adult men, carry the wounds and scars of sexual abuse in our childhoods, and physical abuse at the hands of adult men, sometimes of women, but. Of course, it's much more often that men are the victims of other men. And I think that just talking about that openly as a result of this case is a positive, development.
In practical terms, in the last minute or two we have left here, we spoke with an education expert, Steve Edwards, last week about ways he has worked with universities to try to prevent this type of sexual abuse from continuing when it's been initially identified, which I think is a big issue with Penn State because there were a number of points at which it could have been interrupted, but it continued. What really specific ways do you think need to be, what processes or policies need to be put in place by universities separate from whatever state legal laws are in place? Because as we saw in Pennsylvania, Joe Paterno may have not done anything illegal necessarily, but he really didn't act proactively, I think, is the argument. What does the institution need to do?
Well, thank you for asking. I mean, my program, the MVP program, honestly, we've been doing this since 1993 in big-time college athletics. We've worked with hundreds of college athletic programs. When I say we, the MVP, Mentors in Violence Prevention model, is really about empowering bystanders, and bystanders in the model are defined as friends and teammates and colleagues and coworkers and family members. Those individuals who are not directly involved in a situation of harassment or abuse or violence, but who are friends with or teammates with or in the same workspace with. And what do we do to speak up, to support our friends, to interrupt the behavior? This is, by the way, this is true in college athletic programs, again, with whom we've been working for almost 2 decades. We talk about all these kind of realistic scenarios, like the scenario that we heard about the guy, Mike McQuarrie seeing in the shower Jerry Sandusky nude with a 10-year-old boy. This is the kind of scenario, I mean, we don't have that exact one, but that's the kind of scenario that we're constantly talking about in our work with college athletes, with college, coaches, with administrators. And a key piece of this, David, what needs to happen on college campuses is we need to institute prevention programming for all student athletes, for all coaches, for all athletic administrators, in addition to, housing people and Greek affairs people and all kinds of things. Often at times adult men in positions of institutional power, whether it's at Penn State or anywhere else, they'll often say things like, oh, the young guys need this, or our 18-year-olds need some, support and some guidance. But we, that is adult men in power, we don't really need this. We're already grown up. We're already mature. And one of the things that we've been saying for years in MVP, and we hope that people will hear it now, is adult men as well as adult women need training on these issues of what to do in situations. What are your ethical responsibilities, not just your legal obligations?
Yeah.
And what we see at Penn State, at least from what I've read, is a failure on many levels of individual men to do the right thing, because there are consequences often in male culture for doing the right thing, right? Yeah. For speaking up. It's not just about knowing what your legal responsibilities are. That's one piece. It's also having the courage to challenge group norms and to be seen as being disloyal, or to be challenging somebody who has more authority than you in a hierarchical workplace where you could lose your job as a result of your truth-telling. And so I think we can't be naive that it's not just about knowing the policies and procedures. We need to give young men and young women and older men and women the space to have conversations about all of these dynamics. And that's what I think, that's the kind of institutional change that I think that needs to be catalyzed by this sad situation.
We've been speaking with Jackson Katz, anti-sexist activist, author, expert on violence, media, masculinity, and co-founder of MVP Strategies. Thanks so much for talking to us, Jackson. Really great to talk to you again.